So this passage from Daniel gives us a great opportunity to start to talk about biblical names. And one thing in particular, the changing of names that happens in the Bible, several different points in the Bible, all the way through, in the Old Testament and the New, we hear some names being changed. And so that's really what we want to talk about tonight. It also gives us an opportunity to look at how naming happens in the Bible and how every name is important and usually tells us something about the character or about God. And this is no different. Briefly, Daniel is a portion of the Bible here where we're talking about way before Christ, 600 years before Christ roughly. And the people of God, the Israelites, are being exiled. They've been taken away from Jerusalem in several different caravans, but they've been taken away from their home nonetheless and from the temple. And so this particular passage is talking about when Nebuchadnezzar, the king, the bad guy from Babylon, has ordered that he wants the best of the best in terms of the young people to be brought to be able to work in his service. And so he's looking for big, strong, beautiful, handsome, just perfect young men like me to be brought. I'm just making sure you're awake to be in his service. And so that's where we are in the Bible. And it's a fascinating 5 or 6 chapters here that talks about how they don't just survive in this, but they thrive. And that's where we get the fiery furnace, and we get the lions, and just some great reading if you want to do that for homework. But just for our purposes tonight are the names. And we get some great Hebrew names here. And so these Hebrew boys that are being brought have some great godly names. Daniel, of course, is the lead character here. A clue, and we're going to talk about this later in the month, but the El is the term for God. And so if you hear anybody's name with El in the Bible, that his name has something, or her name has something to do with God. And Daniel's no different. And so his name means God is my judge. God is my judge. And that's going to play out in the story from the very beginning. God is my judge. Hananiah is his Hebrew friend, and his name has the English letters AH. That's going to be a clue of Yahweh, which is the proper name of God. And and so it also means God. We'll talk about that in a few weeks as well. But his name means Yahweh has been gracious. And so God has been gracious. It's a beautiful name, I guess, both of those. Mishael is who is what God is. Who is what God is. It's another godly name. And Azariah means Yahweh has helped. So God has helped. And so all 4 of these Hebrew boys have beautiful godly names that are going to help tell the story going forward. And so it's nothing really new. We're going to hear names in the previous parts of the story and of the Bible, and going forward, we're going to hear these godly names for these Hebrew kids that tell us something about them and something about God. But here's why it's really important, especially as these guys are going into exile. They're going into a foreign land with foreign gods. Their names are important, just like we've shared here our story. Our names, their names, these godly names reminds them of their identity. All of their names literally have God in their names. And so it's going to remind them of their identity, who they belong to. And it's going to remind them of their heritage in God and in Israel. And so no matter what happens here, if they can retain their identity and their heritage, that's going to be an important part of their name, and that's why it's important. That's also why the foreign court and the chief priest of the king in Babylon wants to change their names, and he does. And so he changes their names to, Daniel is to Belshazzar, which means may Bel protect his life. Bel was the god Marduk, which was God little g, and he was the great evil god of Babylon. And so they had all sorts of gods, but he was the great evil god. And so that's not a very good name to have. Shadrach means command of Aku, the moon god. And so he got the moon god's name. Meshach received the name, Mishael became Meshach, sorry. Hananiah became Shadrach, sorry, I missed that part. So Mishael's changed to Meshach, and his name means who is what Aku is. So who is what the moon god is. And so he's related to the moon god there in his naming too. Azariah becomes Abednego, and Abednego means servant of Nebu, who was the god of wisdom and literature. Hebrew, like that. So Abednego could be your nickname, Hebrew. And so, it's an interesting part of this story too, that you and I, in Sunday school or in preaching, we remember these three guys, Daniel's friends, by their Babylonian names. Meshach, Abednego, I said them out of the order, so I can't do it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's how we remember their names. And so it's kind of a strange thing, right? That we remember them by their evil name or their godless names. Except for Daniel. Now Daniel retains his name and refers to himself as Daniel all the way through. He never claims that Babylonian name. And so we think about it, gives us a chance to think about why would the chief priest that's trying to train these Hebrews up in the ways of Babylonian culture and religion, and you can see and you can answer for yourself why it would be important for them to change them from these Hebrew names. So the king and the chief priest wants to cut them off from who they are. They're trying to brainwash them, and so one of the first things they're going to attack before they do any of the other training is they change their names. It cuts them off from who they are. It cuts them off from the home they belong and the parents that named them. It cuts them off from what they know about themselves. And think about how your name has helped shape you, or how you at least lived into your name. Same for these guys. And so to change that, it cuts them off from what they know about themselves. It cuts them off from their families. And then ultimately, and most importantly, it cuts them off from their identity in God, in Yahweh. And so that is why the chief priest did that as the first act. Let's change their names, and then we'll be well on our way to getting them to forget everything that lay behind and focus on going forward, turning them into what we need in the Babylonian Empire. And so it's a great passage, just kind of set the tone about how name changing works and why it's important, and in this case, in a negative example. It's not always negative examples in the Bible. Here it's a foreign king, Nebuchadnezzar, that's doing the naming, and it's for an evil purpose. But sometimes our name changes are very positive, and we go back to the very beginning of the Bible. One of the most, and probably the most important name change that happens in the Bible is when Jacob's name is changed to Israel. Right? Jacob wrestles with God. It's that great passage where he's having to fight with his brother Esau, and Jacob's name meant supplanter, or from supplanter, and Jacob kind of tricked his brother, his twin. He tricked his twin to get his inheritance, and through this chase scene, and he's trying to get away from his brother because his brother's figured this out. He has this night off to himself, and there's this wrestling scene. It's in Genesis chapter 32. It's great literature and reading, and a great story about God as well. And God at the end, or the person that he wrestled with, Jacob says to him, before I go, I want a blessing from you. And the blessing involves changing his name. He says, from now on, Jacob, you will be known as Israel. You will be known as Israel. And so that's a positive name change. And so Israel's going to live into that name as the leader of God's people going forward. We can actually go back further and remember Abram and Sarai. Their names are changed. Abram, when they're having a conversation about offspring and having babies, and Sarai, how did she react to God saying she was going to get pregnant? She what? She laughs, right? So she laughs. And so through all this, it's a great story, great passage. Eventually, God changes Abram's name to Abraham. So it goes from high father to father of multitude. And so Abraham's going to be the father of of many and a large nation, and so his name is changed for that purpose. Sarah, from Sarah meaning my princess, to Sarah meaning mother of nations. So all these names mean something, and it actually tells us in these passages, about this process and what the names mean, which is kind of cool. Another fun example in the Old Testament, and sticking with Genesis, where a foreigner renames a person of God, but in a positive way, is Pharaoh renames Joseph, gives Joseph another name. And he's not mad at him, he's not trying to trick him. Joseph has saved the Pharaoh and saved the people of Egypt. And so he gives him a new name, Zephanath Paneah, which means one who furnishes the nourishment of life. And so he gives him a name, and that's more like a nickname, your mom. And so he's not necessarily changing his name, but giving him a nickname while he's doing his work for the people of Egypt. And so that was kind of a cool one. It doesn't stop in the New Testament. In the New Testament, probably the most famous New Testament change of name is actually not a change of name. And one of the first people that ever pointed that out to me was Keith. I think Keith did some research on that or knew about, and what I'm talking about is Saul to Paul. And so we all grew up learning that when Saul had his conversion from persecuting Christians to being a Christian, that as his eyes were opened, he actually had a name change to Paul. And it's not exactly how the scriptures read, so it illustrates not a name change, but another very common first century, and actually even before that, name practice, and that was to have dual names. And so he was called Saul by God after that conversion on Damascus Road. And so we get proof that it didn't change, because God calls him Saul again later on. And then also, it was just a common practice. So it was Saul and Paul, he went by both. And we know your grandfather had like 4 names. George, Melvin, whatever. Yeah, so it's even common for us too. So I just thought that was one of the most famous New Testament name changes is actually probably not a name change, but a dual name. However, we do have some name changes in the New Testament. Jesus actually changes Simon's name. He says to Simon, you're now going to be known as, what? Peter. Right, the rock. All right? And it's when he's first calling him as an official disciple. And so it does happen in the New Testament. Even Jesus gets involved in changing names. And so our names that are so important to our identity and our heritage, our stories, our past, and our future in terms of living up to our name, as Pastor Melissa maybe kind of alluded to with her last names. Our nicknames come into play in terms of maybe how we were as a child or a youth. Maybe we carry some titles, and titles are forms of names as well. Mom, dad, uncle, coach, Mr. and Mrs. if you're a teacher, or wherever the case may be. And so titles kind of play into that same identity role. And certainly none of us never usually go through a name change, like God looks down on us and says, Keith, you're now going to be known as fill in the blank. And that doesn't really happen. But there is a place where we do claim a new name. And that is when we say yes to Jesus and we become a disciple, we claim the name Christian. And so that's a way of thinking about our name changing and at least our identity changing. Our identity comes less wrapped up into who we are as John or a Rudolph or a Naylor or a Johnson, and we claim a new identity. What does it mean to be in Christ's family? What does it mean? And actually the name Christian, in the Greek, it comes out to being belonging to Christ. And so it means we belong to Christ. Our identity now is that we belong to Christ. The first time in the Bible where that comes into play is Acts chapter 11, where we hear the term Christian being used in Antioch for the very first time. And so I just invite you think about these name changes and what our names mean, and as a way to introduce this series and to think about and what, what it means to belong to Christ in this case, and to claim our ultimate identity as we celebrate our own given names, and we celebrate our surnames, and we celebrate our married names, and we celebrate our extended family and how important those stories are to us. Ultimately, our identity and our mission is derived from claiming the name Christian. And so I invite you to think about that tonight as we pray. Gracious God,